This is likely a hopelessly self-indulgent effort on my part, but as many will know, Angelee Sailer Anderson, my beloved wife of nearly 40 years, died 3 years ago today on Valentine's Day. So I decided to record a read-aloud of a short fantasy story that I wrote in the early part of 1983, and then turn it into a video for our Stone and Sail YouTube channel to post on this 2024 Valentine's Day. I wrote the story a little more than a year after we met, and shortly after we became engaged to be married, and it was called The Story of Lady Angelee and the Rivermoth. It had metaphorical, if that's the right word, allusions to various persons and places and events in our own relationship, but it is intended primarily as a light, enjoyable story in itself. I had decided back then to do it up as a Valentine's Day present, and it started out as a seemingly simple idea of typing the story out to be presented to her. I fussed with ideas to turn it into something more, and it turned out to be a fairly involved final product. After finishing writing the story, I designed and constructed with materials at hand an actual hardbound book with actual hand-lettered text. Looking at it now, it is hard for me to imagine going to that amount of work to actually get it finished in time for the upcoming Valentine's Day back then. The video shows pictures of my hand holding the book open, and the page changes as my reading aloud progresses through the story, and shows the details of the printing I did by hand. Even now I wonder how I managed to get through that process. The original book had no pictures or illustrations, but after giving it to her as a present on Valentine's Day, we had thought of doing up some images to go along with the story and took some photos at the local park. Nothing ever really happened with those pictures, though more stories from the story's setting in Brindle Valley came about later. More about that in an addendum at the end of the read-aloud. And I have artificially added, with video editing software, some of those images into the frame of the pages shown in the video. Here then is my reading aloud of the book. The Story of Lady Angelee and the Rivermoth by Stanley E. Anderson. Works by Stanley E. Anderson. Angelee's Birthday Clues. Sonnet for an English Lady. The Story of Lady Angelee and the Rivermoth. First edition. Copyright 1983 by SCA Publishing, all rights reserved. Printed in the United States of America. The winter had been a long and cold one, with bitter winds, and seldom had the people of Brindle Valley set out from their houses except in need. But now the sun had been shining steadily in blue skies for several days, and spring could not be far away. It was on one such bright morning that Lady Angelee arose and flung open her chamber windows. She gazed out over the field that in the fullness of spring would become a rich green meadow with patches of beautiful colors from many wildflowers. The field stretched away to the slopes of the cloak-fern hills, where already the early grasses were bringing color and life back to them. Lady Angelee drew a deep breath of the crisp morning air and clapped her hands together. She turned, smiling, and said to her handmaidens waiting at the doorway, "Today I shall ride over the cloak-fern hills to the Violet River, so that I may sit on its banks and dream of wonderful things. Who can say? Perhaps I will have fortune enough to snatch a Valentine stone from out of the river." The Violet River was itself a wonderful thing. It was so named because of the many beautiful violet-colored stones that lay beneath the swiftly flowing waters on the riverbed. On sunny days they sparkled brilliantly and imbued the water with a soft violet glow. They were called Valentine stones, and it was said that any who could grasp one from beneath the icy waters would, on the same day, find true love. Lady Angelee had long desired one of these stones, and had often attempted to remove one from the riverbed, but in vain. They were very elusive, and though they were tales of people who possessed Valentine stones, and of the magical spells that could be cast or broken with one, Lady Angelee had never seen one outside the waters of the Violet River. Soon Lady Angelee was dressed and ready for her ride. She had prepared a small case with some food and drink, and had donned her favorite riding cloak. As she walked out of the great hall doors of her father's house, her manservant was just bringing a horse from the stables. He stepped to the side and bowed low before Lady Angelee. She reached up and mounted the horse, while the manservant began to strap the case to the saddle. "Your pardon, please, my lady," he said, "but ought you to ride this distance today alone? It is still very early in the year. The days are not yet long or warm, and there could be danger riding at night, should you tarry too long at the river." Lady Angelee laughed. "Oh, Jonathan," she said, "always so cautious you are with me. I have been many times to the Violet River, and riding even at my leisure would consume hardly 2 hours' time. And how early can be the year when only the lack of multitudes of wildflowers in the fields betrays that this is not a glorious spring day? Why, even so, some early flowers are blooming already. You may go and tell father that I shall stay at the river but a couple of hours and return before dark." Whereupon Lady Angelee rode off across the field toward the Cloakfern Hills. When she had ridden over the first rise, she brought the horse to a walk and looked back to make sure that she was out of view of the large house and Jonathan. "I suppose I should not tease him so," she thought. "He does mean well." Then her attention was diverted by 2 rabbits running across the pathway. They stopped by the roots of a large oak tree and watched the horse and lady ride by. "Good morning, rabbits," said Lady Angelee. "Would you like to follow me to the Violet River? We could be the first ones to visit the pretty waters this year." She laughed and rode on, singing to herself. "Shall we follow her?" said one of the rabbits. "She may be right." "Don't be silly," said the other. "We have no time for such things. Besides, she is too late. The butterflies are always the first one to visit the Violet River." Lady Angelee had spoken truly to Jonathan, however. Indeed, in shortly less than 2 hours she came to the crest of the last hill over which she could look down on the Violet River. Though she had seen it often, the first glance from atop this hill was always one of awe. Suddenly she recalled the previous night's dream, which she had forgotten till now. Most of it was vague and shadowy, but she did remember that someone or something had spoken lines to her which she said aloud. "A stone from the river of violet fire shall not be withdrawn but by trust, and then duly. For power it holds to reveal heart's desire. Yet too by the stone shall thy love thou see truly." Lady Angelee rode down to the river's edge and tied the horse to an old tree trunk lying on the ground. As the rabbit had predicted, butterflies were in plentiful numbers about the Violet River. They were exceptionally large and brightly colored, and for a moment their beauty attracted Lady Angelee's attention away from the violet glow of the river. But then she knelt down beside the river and looked at the bed under the rippling waters for the Valentine stones strewn among the rocks and pebbles. It was not difficult to see that there was a good number of them there. They sparkled several places in the immediate area where Angelee knelt, but whenever she would look directly at a spot where one of the stones seemed to sparkle, it either faded or disappeared from view, so that she was never able to see one clearly. Sometimes, though, she thought she could tell which stone had been sparkling, and would try to reach carefully into the water and pick it up. But the water rippled over the rocks so swiftly that her eyes could not follow the distorted image, and when she drew out a stone she couldn't be sure it was the one she had been looking at. She also tried scooping out a handful of stones from one of the spots and sorting through the pile, but with equally poor luck. As she sat there searching, the butterflies chided her as they flew overhead. "Look at the foolish girl," said one, giggling to another. "She tries and tries to pick up one of the pretty rocks and cannot. She always takes the wrong one." Another teased, "If she were as pretty as we, she would not need one. Everybody would love her then." On and on they went, flying this way and that. Lady Angelee paid them no attention. After a while she grew tired of searching and gave up. She walked back to the horse and unstrapped the case that held her food. She sat down on a smooth rock and began slicing some of the fruit she had brought. As she ate the first slice, a brown rivermoth darted by and then flew back and landed on the case next to her. "Hello, Rivermoth," said Lady Angelee. "You are a friendly one today, not like those flighty butterflies that flutter around one's head and then flit off ever so fitfully." The Rivermoth said nothing. Every once in a while it would dart again into the air, back and forth, and then alight back onto the case or nearby on the large rock while Lady Angelee continued talking to it. "You certainly aren't as pretty as the butterflies," she said. "They have such slender, delicate bodies, while yours is thick and hairy. And of course their wings display beautiful colors and patterns, while yours are rather dull brown." She ate the last piece of fruit and gazed at the Rivermoth for a moment. "Still," she said, "you do have a kind of earthy appeal about you. I won't shoo you away like some people would that I know." Then she told the Rivermoth about her desire for a Valentine stone, and about one of her handmaiden's skill at dressmaking, and about the new manservant, Jonathan, that her father had hired last year, and about all sorts of things, until finally she decided that it was time for her to start riding back home. "Perhaps I will see you next time I come here," she said, mounting the horse and gathering up her things. "I have enjoyed spending the afternoon with you." As Lady Angelee began to ride off, she did not notice that the Rivermoth flew up behind her and settled into a crevice between the saddle and the case. On the journey home, she rode at a somewhat quicker pace. Although she often set her will against his, she liked Jonathan, and wanted him to know that he need not worry about her safety during her trips to the Violet River. When she arrived at the house, it was well before sundown, and one of the older servants came to take her horse. "Where is Jonathan?" she asked. "He always attends to my horse." The servant was reluctant to speak. "He is not here," he said, and led the horse away. Somewhat confused, Lady Angelee walked in the hall doors where she expected to be greeted by one of her handmaidens, but none were there. Perhaps father has required all the servants for some reason, she thought, and walked upstairs to her chamber where she hung up her cloak in the wardrobe and walked over to the window she had stood at that morning. Just then, the Rivermoth flew up through the window into her room. It fluttered around for a moment and then landed on one of the tapestries that hung on the wall. "Why, Rivermoth," said Lady Angelee, startled. "You must have followed me home. I'm so happy you came. You may stay here if you like." The Rivermoth accepted her invitation and remained on the tapestry, unmoving. Just then there was a knock at her door, and Sarah, one of her handmaidens, entered her chamber. "Please, my lady," Sarah said, "forgive our absence at your return today, but we have been attending to your father and the visitor." "Oh? Who is this visitor? We have not expected anyone," said Lady Angelee, curious about any persons who came to her father's council unannounced. Sarah looked around cautiously and said in a hushed voice, "It is Lord Droffnetter, my lady." Lady Angelee drew a deep breath and sat on her bed. "Why is he here, and why has father allowed such a man into our house?" she asked. "Nobody knows, my lady," said Sarah, "but it is some sort of official business. It is rumored that he came to take the manservant Jonathan away." "Surely, my lady, Lord Droffnetter cannot do this, can he?" "I don't know," said Lady Angelee, "but if these rumors are true, I shall be sorely saddened." She paused for a moment contemplative. Then she said, "I have need of nothing now, Sarah. You may leave me alone here, but please tell me immediately of any news you hear." There was no more news that day, but when Lady Angelee awoke the next morning, Lord Droffnetter had already departed, as quickly and unexpectedly as he had arrived, said the servants. Jonathan was not seen for the next few days, and Lady Angelee sadly guessed that he had been taken away. Her father would say nothing of the matter. As the days passed, the Rivermoth remained, for the most part, on the tapestry in the chamber. Occasionally it would fly out of the window and over the field, but always it would return before Lady Angelee closed the windows in the evening. One day the handmaiden, Sarah, was dusting the chamber while Lady Angelee read from a large book of scripture at her desk. Suddenly Sarah started with a gasp, and Lady Angelee turned to look. "What is it, Sarah?" she said. "Oh, it is nothing, my lady," said Sarah. "It is only a large moth," at which she drew a piece of rag from her apron pocket and prepared to kill it with a swat. "No, don't do that," explained Lady Angelee, but it was too late. Sarah had thrust at the moth with a good portion of her strength. So much so, in fact, that the tapestry came tumbling down over Sarah, knocking down a vase of flowers mid-fall, and spilling water all over the floor. But speed and accuracy were not Sarah's strength. The Rivermoth had flitted quickly away before Sarah's hand could reach the wall, and it had watched the cascade of falling objects from well behind Sarah's head. Sarah was profusely apologetic and began immediately cleaning up the mess. Lady Angelee could only laugh uncontrollably when she saw that the Rivermoth was safe. So funny did Sarah look, covered with the tapestry. Finally she regained her composure and said, "Please don't harm it, Sarah. It has been here several days and does not hurt anything, and I rather like it. It will not hurt you either." Sarah obeyed and hung the tapestry back in its place, at which the Rivermoth resumed its previous position, and finished her dusting, though afterwards avoiding the vicinity of the tapestry. She did not like bugs of any kind. After a fortnight, Lady Angelee desired once more to return to the Violet River, and prepared her few provisions one morning. As she gathered her riding cloak from the wardrobe, she glanced at the tapestry and saw the Rivermoth resting there. "I wonder if it will follow me again," she thought, and walked out to her horse, whence she mounted and rode off. As surely, the Rivermoth flew out of the window and on to its place in the saddle. When Lady Angelee reached the river, she tied the horse to the log and prepared once more to search for a Valentine stone. But now the Rivermoth fluttered around her head and disturbed her. "Rivermoth," she said, "I knew you would come. This time you can watch me search for— Oh my, please stop that. You are becoming as bad as the butterflies." Suddenly the Rivermoth flew away from her head and out over the water. It darted here and there, pausing for a moment and then going on. As Lady Angelee watched it, she noticed that it seemed to pause always over a spot where a Valentine stone appeared to be sparkling. "Perhaps it means to help me look," she thought. when she remembered the lines from her dream again. A stone from the river of violet fire shall not be withdrawn but by trust, and then duly, for power it holds to reveal heart's desire. Yet too by the stone shall thy love thou see truly. I shall trust the Rivermoth to guide me, thought Angelee, and she walked to the edge of the river close to where the Rivermoth hovered. Then, without turning her eyes from the Rivermoth, dipped her hands into the water directly underneath it, and enclosed a stone between her cupped hands. Slowly she drew the stone out of the water, still not daring to look at it. She stood up and walked over to the same large rock where she had sat before, and dried the stone in her cloak lining. Then with care she sat down nervously, opened her hands outward before her to reveal the stone lying in her palms. It glittered brightly in the sun, sending out rich violet rays in every direction. Its beauty brought tears to her eyes, and she gazed at it as if in timeless wonder. Suddenly the Rivermoth flew down from behind her and lighted on the stone. Lady Angelee would have guessed that even the butterfly's beauty would be paled next to this stone, but instead it seemed to augment the Rivermoth's own beauty. Certainly she had never seen the delicate patterns on the Rivermoth's wings, and they contained so many deep hues of browns and tans. Why had she never noticed such beauty before, she thought. As she studied the patterns and colors more closely, they enveloped her attention until they seemed to be all about her. And now she saw that she was not looking at a moth's wings at all, but rather finely woven and textured cloth decorated intricately with the same brown patterns. Still stranger, she realized that she was no longer holding the stone, but was, instead, laying her forehead on the chest of a tall man wearing a tunic of the same brown cloth. Hanging about his neck was a chain holding the Valentine stone in a gold mounting. Lady Angelee looked up at the man's face, and he stared back at her, smiling. "Jonathan," she cried, "what has happened? Where have you been, and how did you appear here?" she asked. "I shall try to explain, my lady," he said. "On the morning that you rode off to this place a fortnight ago, I went back to the stables to place new hay for the horses. After a while I heard someone come to the stables and look up to see who had entered. It was your father. He does not come often to the stables himself, and I was surprised to see him there. 'How may I aid you, Lord?' I asked him. He replied, 'I am in no need of aid, Jonathan. However, you are in grave danger. Your former master, Lord Droffnetter, seeks you, and sits this very moment in my council room. I can little aid you concerning his claims, but I can offer you this. Your father held out a pendant and chain. It has magic about it, he said. The person who puts it around his neck will be changed into another shape. What sort, I cannot say. But take heed of this warning. The pendant is missing its central stone, and so the spell may not be broken, except with one of the magical stones from the Violet River. The use of the pendant would therefore be of great peril to you, but do with it as you dare.' So saying, your father left, and I decided that I must take my chance with the pendant. When I put it around my neck, you may rightly guess that my shape was changed to that of a river moth. I then flew to the Violet River where you sat on this rock. You will know the rest of the story, my lady." Lady Angelee nodded her head. "But if all the tales about Valentine stones be true, then you are also to be the fulfillment of my heart's desire." "I may not judge my lady's heart," said Jonathan. "But for my part, I would say that I have loved you long, though I dare now only proclaim this to you." I do not know how I feel," said Lady Angelee, and was silent. "Then we shall ride back to your father's house for now," said Jonathan. They mounted the horse and rode together back through the hills. As they rode, clouds gathered, and soon rain began to fall. Jonathan stopped the horse. "This rain will not last long," he said. "We shall wait for it to end." Whereupon he helped Lady Angelee down, and together they sat under the wide fan-like branches of a large cloak fern. "In Brindle Valley," said Jonathan, "the branches of the cloak fern are hung in the room where weddings are performed to symbolize our Lord's love surrounding, as a cloak, the wedded couple. As we sit here, guarded from the rain by these same branches, my lady, I would ask you to become my bride. Will you do such a thing?" Lady Angelee looked again at the Valentine stone hanging from Jonathan's neck. She reached up and enclosed the pendant in her hand, and knew at last her love for him. Yet too by the stone shall thy love thou see truly, she remembered. She whispered into his ear simply, yes. Lady Angelee and Jonathan were married soon after and lived many long and happy years together. They visited the Violet River often and built a large and beautiful house in Brindle Valley. It is said that never were any moths disturbed that chose to visit this house, and it is also said that cloak ferns adorned its entrance ever. And Addendum. Sometime after I had given the Valentine's Day book to Angelee, I woke up in the middle of the night with the strangest sensation. Stories and stories and stories connected with Brindle Valley from the book were running through my head as though they were assaulting my brain. I was not even trying to think of them. They simply forced their way in. I tried to write the basic ideas down on a tablet of paper as fast as I could before they faded and disappeared, as dreams and such will do. Shades of Coleridge's Kubla Khan, eh? In the morning, I told Angelee about the experience and showed her the notes I had written down. They each had metaphorical connections to various family members, and so we decided to do a follow-up book, a collection of those stories. Angelee took my notes and wrote them up in her rich poetic style, aside from the original story, which we left intact and as is. In the collection is told the origin of the Violet River and the Valentine stones. It turns out that those seeming jeweled stones were actually seeds from the fruit of a tree that grew up from a seed that originally came from the magical place Fairy. That tree grew on the banks of the river, and the fruit from that tree and their seeds dropped into the river, giving it the violet glow. The various stories tell of the fairly complex and involved adventures of the characters and of the eventual loss and destruction of the Violet River, but with a kind of fantasy and magical redemption of the stones at the end. And then we fashioned a physical book to contain the stories and made 7 copies. We had a Christmas gathering at our house, our rental for the first 2 years we were married, that we named the Grey Havens, with those relatives attending and read the stories aloud. At the end of the evening, we gave a copy to each of the guests, 1 copy per married couple. I'm of course not going to read that 70-page set of stories aloud here, but I thought I would read the opening pages and the titles of the stories in the table of contents, and read aloud the short epilogue at the end. In it you will hear vague hints and references to many of those events in the stories. And so, without further ado, a quick tour through Tales from the Violet River. Tales from the Violet River by Stanley and Angelee Anderson. Other works by the same authors: Sonnet for an English Lady, The Kite Song, Advent of Literacy, Sonnet for AI, Angelee's Birthday Clues, The Accuser, My Eyes Have Seen Messiah, The Candlestick, The Morning After, An October Evening's Prayer, Ariel, He Who Dreams Alone, The Initiation of Luke, Dinner Invitation for Rig and Dan, Robert Lord Randall, Troubadour, The Hall of Enchantments, The Locket, Coronation of the Roses, etc. The characters in these stories are not wholly imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons and animals now living is strictly intentional. First edition, copyright 1984, by Red Rose, White Rose Publishing. All rights reserved. Printed in the United States of America. Dedication. To our families. Mom and Dad A, Mom and Dad N, Baba and Dottie, Bonnie and Dwayne, Julia, Bruce, and Chablis. Contents. Prologue. The Hall of Carvings. The Story of Lady Angelee and the Rivermoth. The Story of Lord Nelson and the Accursed Tower. The Story of the Scribe and the Blacksmith. In the House of Good Fortune. The Story of Day and Night. The Story of Lady Marna and the Catbane. The Story of Andrew Cartmaker and the Orchard of Fruit. The Story of Queen Dorothy and the Dragon. The Dimming of the Violet River. Epilogue. The Necklace of Tales. Epilogue. The Necklace of Tales. Though the battle of the Violet River had ended in victory for the lovers of the stones, much that was encompassed in their love would not again be as it had been. The cloak-fern hills about the region of the river had been brutally ravaged, and the river sent forth its light no longer except in memory. In hope that the stones might heal this blighted legacy of the conquered darkness, the fruits of that felled tree of faerie were gathered up, and many of the Valentine stones abiding in their hearts were planted near the dry riverbed, and around the shores of the dragon-shaped lake. Nowhere did the blessed seeds spring up into trees again, for all but a lingering remnant of the stone's power had passed away, their time of preeminence within the world of men being done. Yet what of their virtue remained was diffused into the land, and soon new blades of brilliant green set the hillsides to glisten like massive emeralds from the hordes of giants. On the shores of the Dragon Lake an unknown flower began to grow, whose crowning beauty was a miniature tower of violet blossoms, and whose scent was like that of purple grapes crushed into wine. When a traveler from Brindle Valley stood by the lake's midnight waters, among an ocean of the flowers flinging their perfume into the breeze, he knew once more, in wistful diminishment, yet in gladness, the glory and the wonder which had been the violet rivers. 12 stones were kept back from the planting, and were set into a necklace by the goldsmiths of King Joseph. In honor of her part in the saving of the kingdom, the necklace was bestowed by the king upon Lady Angelee, and thus the house she shared with Jonathan in Brindle Valley became the final resting place in a light lent by heaven. To Jonathan, who possessed some skill in the shaping of wood, was given the trunk of the violet river tree, and this he attempted to fashion into carvings, which would commemorate the river with its history and legends. But though he toiled long over them, he was not able to complete the pieces to his liking. For many years they stood half-formed in a corner of his workshop, collecting dust. One morning before dawn, Jonathan woke with the sure sense that the time was come for the carvings to be formed aright. Rising from the bed of brass under whose rose-colored sheets Lady Angelee still slept, he hobbled onto his cane into the workshop to study the long-neglected blocks of wood. To his great grief, he found that the carvings were gone. Returning to the bedchamber, he awoke his gray-haired wife, and walking out into their garden of red and white blooms, they spoke of the sorrows and joys they had known in union through years that were past. They held each other's withered bodies close, and their dimming eyes sought comfort in the soft radiance of the necklace of Valentine stones resting upon the embroidered silk of Lady Angelee's nightdress. Then from the stones there flashed forth a light of profound and poignant glory, as behind the aged couple the sun ascended to its orient throne. The colors of their garden caught fire, and ran away like melted wax in rivers of white and red. They turned to see the house's gables and turrets dissolving within a curtain of shimmering rain, leaving only the cloak-ferns which beckoned them forward to a shelter unknown, yet enfolded by love. They approached the curtain and passed into it, and beneath the rains the lines of their skin and the frailty of their limbs washed away to join the fiery rivers. When they emerged on the downpour's further side, their bodies were young and strong, and more beautiful than in their mortality, and they were clothed in the shining robes of those blessed who dwell beyond faery's border. As they walked onward through fields of living things whose names they were yet to learn, they came upon a circle of standing stones. The stones were black as onyx, and in the midst of the circle were the unfinished carvings which had preceded their artist to their wood's native realm. As Jonathan and Lady Angelee drew near the circle, the stones began to change. From onyx black to the clearness of diamond they turned, to form a castle of splendor unparalleled but by the eternal city's pavements of gold. Lady Angelee felt the stones pulsing about her neck, and knew by their return to their place of origin their power had been rekindled, never to dim again. The drawbridge of the castle descended, and 3 wondrous beings came forth from the gate. On the right hand and on the left were the noble unicorn and the golden dragon who had won undying renown in the battle of the Violet River. Between them walked the wizard of the stones, his face aflame with joy. He led Jonathan and his lady into the structure of glass that was to be their dwelling. After journeying through a glistening maze of stairways and corridors, they arrived at a hall wherein the fairy-wood carvings stood fully wrought, endued by an art beyond Jonathan's with the semblance of unfeigned truth. Then spoke the wizard, "Lovers of the stones and of their light, you have wielded the seeds of faery well. Soon the hour will come when they shall bear their fruit for those who are bidden." So a bidding was composed and writ in golden ink, and at Yuletide it went forth to where among the children of men there abode a clan of mysterious likeness to the carvings of wood. The guests raised their eyes from the final carving, that of a handsome young warrior being knighted by a king. Between the image of the maiden with the moth and this last they had beheld many others, a magic pendant upon a pedestal, a scribe dipping her quill beside a blacksmith pounding his anvil, a serving-man holding the moon and stars in his hand, and a serving-maid holding the sun. They had studied the portrayals of a lady with a bottle looking upon a cat with raised hackles, of a cook bearing a tray of pastries, and of a noble queen combing the curly hair of a silver dog. Their journey through the hall had left them strangely weary, as though they had gone beyond hearing the histories which the carvings set forth into living the tales with their own blood and bones and hearts. Yet as intimately as they seemed to know the people of the Violet River with their gladnesses and griefs, the guests felt that there remained something of grave import they had failed to see. Searching for the revelation of that secret, they gazed deep into the eyes of the hostess. Her eyes smiled at them through the wells of delight, and glanced down towards her own person. The eyes of the guests followed her glance, and saw a chain of violet stones. The hostess reached her fingers into the chain, and touched a stone. From it there fell like a tear a drop of radiance, and became within their hand a book bound in violet. Each of the stones was touched in turn, and each guest bore away from the hall a gift of a volume from the Necklace of Tales. Yet around the neck of the lady of the crystalline castle the stones remained. The end.